I'm going to present some contrasting and different forms of feminist anti-militarist activism. I'm going to look at women in black, and I'm also going to look at women's non-violent direct action around peace camps. And I'm going to see how activism and research plays out, what their relationship is in these different contexts. My particular position will come from that of a gendered analysis of militarism, which I think is crucial in assisting us to challenge both gender relations and also to challenge militarism. Women in Black is an international network. It's based around autonomous groups of vigils which oppose violence, militarism and war. I'm a member of the London Vigil, and as the image shows, we don't really have any problem with using the word militarism in a public space. The Vigil is Women in Black's main form of action. We stand silently in black, and we present quite radical analysis of gender and militarism, or gendered understandings of particular wars to the general public. We stand under the Edith Cavell statue, which is slightly ambiguous, in St Martin's Lane, opposite the National Portrait Gallery. Somehow the symbolism works. The black, the silence, and the stillness attracts the attention of passers-by. But there are always a couple of women leafleting so that we can actually engage in conversations with the public and ask them to sign letters or any other form of activity we're doing around the vigil. So why black and why in silence? In October 91, on the eve of the wars in Yugoslavia, a group of women in black in Serbia who were engaged in opposing their government's war and their government's militarism said, "Usually women dress in black for the death of people close to them. We, on the other hand, dress in black to mourn the death of people both known and unknown, victims of this war. We dress in black to protest against the irresponsible and nationalistic leaders responsible for the victims of this war. These leaders utilize military power and violence as their only argument. Our silence characterizes the life of the majority of the citizens of this country. The mass media is closed to us. We want to demonstrate that silence does not mean approval, but it means the contrary. Silence expresses our refusal of war and any type of war." And that's really what informs most women in black groups around the world. It is protest, but it's also performance. It's a performance in a public space, and somehow our stance enables us to present quite uncompromising messages on gender and militarism to people walking past, on their way home from work, on their way to the theatre, tourists, Londoners. Women in Black was formed in Israel about 25 years ago, when Israeli women, later joined by Palestinian women, silently protested their opposition to the occupation of Palestinian territory. This idea of the women in silence and in black as a formula for action was then transposed from Israel to Italy by Italian women in black, Donne Nere, who then took the idea to Serbia, and so the idea spread. In August this year, Women in Black's international conference took place in Montevideo, in Uruguay. And from those early beginnings, it addressed gender-based violence in the home, at work, in the streets, and in war. So that continuity of violence is something that Women in Black continue to address. Ana Valdez was one of the women organising that meeting. She was tortured and jailed for 4 years for her resistance to former dictatorship. But she sees the connection between the extraordinarily high incidence of violence of women in Uruguay now with the beatings, rape, torture and murder that they endured under the dictatorship. She says this country is not at war now, but the war continues against the oppression of women and the poor. In London and elsewhere across the UK, vigils started in the early 90s, predominantly in response to the war in the Balkans and very influenced by Women in Black in Serbia, and allied with the sort of first European campaign for rapes and other war crimes of sexual violence to be prosecuted. Of course, that has taken us from the ICTY through to the International Criminal Court, but more recently we have just been holding a large number of vigils on the same issue in the DRC. Running through each of the vigils is a call for alternative definitions of security that do not rely on militarism and war, and which reflect in a way the sort of demands that were coming from activists in the global south a few years ago for a gendered understanding of security that is not a militarized security, but that provides people with the basic human rights, water, education, healthcare, freedom to live without violence. And for resources that are currently spent on the military to be allocated to, in this present time, to redressing some of the cuts that are being made in social and other services. If we look at the relationship between women in black and women's peace or anti-war groups and academia or theory, few of us locate our activism within an explicitly theoretical framework. We've got many motives and perspectives in joining women in black or other anti-war groups. It can be feminist, you might be a humanitarian, some may have a gender theory of war, others may see class and race as far more important to their understanding. There are obviously some exceptions. Having been at many peace camps, it's sometimes very difficult when researchers or academics turn up and sort of come and ask you over your breakfast what you think about the current state of relationships between, I don't know, two warring parties or something like that. I mean, it's a very strange relationship. But there are some exceptions. Some researchers actually lived at the camp and then later went on to actually produce an analysis of what was going on. And I think that sort of looking at alternative ways of producing knowledge is one of the things that really came out, particularly of the work that Sasha Roseneal did, because she proposed that women at the camp were engaged in an active development of theory which constructed itself. And she described this as cognitive praxis, and I think we would probably have described it as learning by doing. Because of the longevity of the camp, and because we were right up against the fence, right up against the USF airbase, there was a constant process of developing creative and innovative forms of action, which aimed to stop, disrupt, impede, and subvert the US cruise missile base. There was also research. You don't successfully oppose a weapon system if you don't know how it works, what it does, the technology behind it, etc. So over the years, this body of researchers really built into a sort of culture of knowledge amongst a wider community and feeds into new tactics and new strategies, although we weren't allowed to use the word strategy because it was far too military. We are allowed to use it now, apparently. Women from the camp went, one of the women is now a leading international expert and advocate for disarmament. I mean, that culture of knowledge continues and is also picked up by new generations of women. At the Aldermaston camp, just going to where the UK's next generation weapons is currently being built, or the facilities for them is being built, the women's camp is actually on Ministry of Defence land. And that is a very interesting relationship. This occupation of military land has presented a direct challenge to the MOD for over 25 years. And in 2007, they introduced new bylaws by which they hoped to make us illegal. And in 2010, we won a judicial review, which actually asserted our right to camp on military land. So there's also that process of challenging the authority of the military and occupying their space. Kevin McSorley, who did a workshop earlier on this morning, has written, "It is not just the bodies of combatants and victims that are produced by and central to war, but the bodies of veterans, witnesses, pacifists, patriots, and many others." And you can see sometimes those bodies are required to form into very strange shapes in order to challenge the military. But in doing that, we are not just challenging the military, but we're challenging the identification of the female as a victim. We're putting our bodies inside their security fences, on top of their fences, in front of their vehicles, outside their bases. And this is also a challenge to the gendering of the female body. In taking active nonviolence, we're also challenging that sort of Gandhian passivity and the construction of femininity and vulnerability. But these particular actions, unlike the actions of women in black, I think are very, even though they take place in military space, they are actually very private, and they are sometimes very intensely personal. So looking forward on how we could sort of move forward to a more inclusive form of activism, I'll go back to women in black. Cynthia Coburn, who we're very lucky to have within our group, is one of the leading academics within this field, and one of her articles is in the background reading for this conference. She says, if the gendered cultures of violence in everyday life bring about widespread acceptance of war, then gender relations as we know and live them must be recognised as causal in war. I think this statement helps us understanding how we can oppose militarism, and recognising that we have to make unacceptable the forms of masculinity or the different masculinities which legitimise and promote violence as a means of resolving conflict both in peacetime and in war. Yet taking this analysis into the peace and anti-war movement, as we've just heard, is actually quite difficult. We're more likely to find within women's anti-militarist groups, women's peace groups, women opposing violence against women, or NGOs like IANSA, which researches and campaigns on the gendered impact of small arms, and has recently got some really good language on women and small arms into the Arms Trade Treaty. We've had far less success in taking this into mixed or anti-militarist movements. Women have been involved in the international No to NATO alliance, but have found extreme difficulty in getting any positive reception for the ideas. Again, I'm going to single out War Resisters International, which is the only group which was really prepared to share with Cynthia in her research into the political and gender dynamics of peace and anti-militarist movements, the difficult and challenging process that they went through in trying to transform WRI from an organisation founded to support male conscientious objectors to one that had the will to actually start exploring the gender dynamics of militarism and its impact on its practice. So I'm just going to finish now by looking at this is an action organised by Women in Black, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Alder Marston Women's Peace Camp, and other women involved in the anti-war movement. And it's a No to NATO action, which we did during the 2010 Lisbon Summit, and on the same day as the Stop the War Coalition March and Rally. We distributed leaflets throughout central London with our sort of gender-based demands of NATO, pausing at regular intervals like this to make the message more visible. We think that between 12 and 15,000 people may have taken a leaflet for us in the course of 3 hours. But maybe it shouldn't have, but what came as a really massive surprise was the number of people who said to us, "And what's NATO?" While this question provided us with an opportunity to inform them, it's a very important learning point for us as the UK government prepares to host the next NATO summit in 2014. We'll be refining our arguments against NATO, but to think this is useful for looking at the way we go forward, we assume that everybody understands how militarism works and how it and how it plays out in their lives. So one of the things, 2014 is a great challenge. Not only is the beginning of the 100th anniversary of the war, but we have this NATO summit. And I think it's a point at which we can think of creative and new and interesting ways in taking that message out to the public, in getting them to understand the significance of militarism, including the NATO alliance, in our everyday lives. Thanks.